And we're off.
Hello.
It's beautiful, Nate. Good to see you again.
Indeed.
So again, I'm not going to bother redoing a fake intro. Let's just do it now. So today I'm talking with my co-host, the great, the wonderful, Dr. Scott Wustenberg, who's staying back after a long day at clinic to talk shop with me. Mate, what are we going to talk about today?
Well, we were continuing on, I think, with thyroid leading into adrenals and the continuing metabolic disturbances.
Oh, it's a big one. Beautiful. Mate, I'll just give you the other little preamble before we get stuck into that exciting stuff. I just, spending my last couple of hours going through laser research. Did you know that there's a website called the World Association for Laser Therapy?
No.
And they've got a set of guidelines for every sort of looks like musculoskeletal condition known to man. But yeah, I was reading this interesting paper on looking at transcranial stuff. And they've found that there's sort of an inhibitory effect and then a stimulatory effect. I'll send you the graph, but it was pretty interesting. It was sort of looking at certain dosages do this. Unfortunately, the way they did it is they taken the neurons out of the brain and then irradiated it and measured things like ATP levels and reactive oxygen species and all sorts of fun things. Mm-hmm. So they found that, surprise, surprise, when you zap brains at high levels, bad things happen. But they are also looking at when you're directly irradiating nerve tissue. So there's obviously skull and a fair bit of depth and stuff that we've got to get through before. So I need, again, someone with some good maths to walk me through dosages and all that sort of thing, the usual dramas. Mate, how's your day been? That's my...
Had a pretty good day.
I've been thinking maths.
Yeah? As I mentioned, I had a new patient who had a lot of suffering going on and has had 7 years of Cymbalta, which is a antidepressant, SNRI, which is both anti-anxiety, so it affects both the dopamine and the serotonin pathways, and fundamentally has just weaned herself off it. She's got a fair bit of side effects. As noted, the anxiety never went away right the way through the whole 7 years of taking it, which is kind of a bit disappointing for her.
Interesting, though.
So, yeah, she wasn't over pleased with the whole thing, but is hopeful that we'll find a different way forward for her at that moment in time.
Well, mate, I couldn't think of someone better up in that part of the world to handle a tricky case like that.
Well, the problem in all of these situations is that she's got a long history, and I mean, it's quite a good kind of case concept to think about. So she's come from a situation as a child where there's a family history of alcoholism and parental separation at about 7 years of age. And so if we think about that, that's going to be driving the mesencephalon, because you're 7 years of age.
Fair bit of stress in that one.
You've got a lot of stress and you're exposed to an environment of constant worry, constant fear. The system doesn't wind itself down. So
fairly critical period as far as neurodevelopment at that 7, because I know it's when it's age 5, you've got one of those critical windows where your brain is going through a mass sort of explosion and pruning. That's when your sort of language critical centers happen, but then through 5 to 7 is sort of that critical window development. So that's a fun time to expose your kid to a lot of stress.
Absolutely. So that then continues on with a series of abusive partners for the mother, including like the house being burnt down and a lot of really significant things. And so this is then kind of led on to her going to university and struggling with that, and then getting put on medication about 7 years ago and continuing on. Now, the history has her having a Celtic background, and the Celts, and this is on both parents' side and both grandparents. So the Celts, Welsh, Irish, Scottish, and the Northern English, and a bunch of other interesting people, have a history of MTHFR gene. So this is a gene that makes an enzyme that converts folate into its active form. Now, that particular gene has some really interesting associations with mental health disorders. It's associated with some schizophrenia and some bipolar, and it's associated with autism. And they've got a whole interesting genetic history associated with alcoholism. So we've got a patient who's really unlikely to be holding on to...
The link there being that alcoholism affects folate absorption?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
For the listeners.
So we've then look at her bloods, and she's got low folate, low B12, and she's got an iron level, as we spoke about previously, of 26. Now, this particular lab has decided that 20 is the cutoff, whereas another lab in a different area might say that 30 is the cutoff. So the doctor's unprepared to do anything about it. Now, again, when we think about adrenal glands, most people think about the adrenal or adrenal problems. Most people think about the adrenal glands as the things sitting on top of the kidneys, and they release hormones including adrenaline and cortisol, as well as DHEA. Now, the problem with this is that most of the issues with adrenaline is actually much more mesencephalic in its operation. So you can't think about the body's stress state as burning out the adrenal glands. You've tired your adrenal glands. This is a brain fatigue pattern because the patient is generally under a massive amount of vigilant stress. Now, I'm raising this in this particular patient case because the patient has had a genetic predisposition to stress brain patterns because we don't make... So folate and B12 are essential, especially with the MTHFR gene, for the production of biopterin, which then gets led down through another methylation pathway to make serotonin and dopamine. So if you don't have MTHFR working properly, you don't have the building block to make your serotonin and dopamine. So you're going to use different pathways to actually try and keep your head above water. But you can't regulate pain properly. You can't regulate mood and emotion properly. You become vastly more anxious and you don't sleep particularly well. And what happens when you don't sleep? You don't heal particularly well. You don't calm your system down. So this poor young lady is genetically predisposed by the looks of things. And I haven't run a full gene panel, so I can't actually say that for certain, but the family history gives us an indication of predisposition to this. Her blood tests show that her building blocks of folate, iron, B12 are also incredibly low. So the likelihood is this has been going on pretty much all her life. And she's running on a mesencephalic hyperdrive, which means that her brain vigilance is constantly under stress. What is it? Is it going to harm me? What is it? Is it going to harm me? We're not going to have been running our frontal lobes or developing really good calming strategies and using our frontals to inhibit, etc. Because she's been her normal is stress. So
it's hard for the get that wind up, and they try and teach. It's very much that feast famine thing. Your brain's constantly saying, "Hey, I'm in a famine," or I'm constantly stressed, and they say, "No, life is good." It's like, no, I'm pretty sure for the last ages it's been stressful. I'm going to stay stressed. You can take your kumbaya and shove it.
That's pretty much it. So she explains that she feels better when she's doing her mindfulness, and she's seen the psychologist. And all those things make her feel better. And they make her feel better temporarily for a short period of time after she's done them. But ultimately, they're not fixing her problem because that wind-up and that adrenal drive for survival is so strong that it's not allowing new pathways to develop.
So it's essentially a case of genetic predisposition towards stress. Combined with stress, combined with the lack of fuels that she needs to get out of a stressful state.
That's exactly it.
So if her iron and folate were up at a decent level, she could start to produce dopamine and serotonin like she should be to help her brain start to calm the hell down. But in the absence of those good building blocks, biochemistry rules all, and mesencephalon comes in and goes, oh, you know what? Fuck that guy.
Yeah, that's exactly what's happening. So my issue is, of course, is that everyone generally, like the natural practitioners, are going to be looking at that situation and say, well, this patient has adrenal fatigue, and we could probably run measurements and say, great, okay, this patient has adrenal fatigue. Look, the cortisol's low at 8 a.m., the adrenaline's low, the DHEA is low, they are burnt out. It's 27 and burnt out, But what you've then got to think about is, how are you going to get those adrenal glands back on board if it's not coming from there?
Well, it's such a... it's like conceptually everyone's sort of still in there, sort of, this is the box that I live in. I don't want to think about how the brain could be driving adrenals because that's just far too complicated. And so the tendency towards approaching any and all adrenal fatigue issue from a purely biochemical approach rather than a brain rehab point of view is just, it starts to become tricky. And then you tell someone that, hey, we need to get that adrenal control under work by doing some brain-based stimulatory work to get your mesencephalon under control, and they're like, your mes and who's or what? So yeah, I totally get it, but it just seems to be such a maybe in another 10 to 15 years, the understanding of the brain will be a little bit more clinically palatable to most people, and that you say that we've got your adrenal function under control, your cortisol rhythms are now normalized. Let's get that mesencephalon rehabbed.
Well, let's hope. Like one way or the other, if they're stuck in that triggered drive, people are not going to get out of their adrenal fatigue, because running from the monster will trump everything that we're doing. And, I keep hearing people talk about, well, let's get you doing some breathing, let's get you doing some yoga, some mindfulness. You know what I tell people to go do?
This is going to be good.
I tell them to go do something, especially a young lady in this sort of pattern where she's been physically and emotionally traumatized since early on. I tell them to go do Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. I'll tell them to go do boxing training. I'll tell them to go take up Kung Fu. Because in those moments, especially something like boxing and Jiu-Jitsu, where it's competitive, you're in someone's personal space, you are being forced to confront the monster at that moment, and you're physically learning new motor skills to help you survive more efficiently.
Well, I do like that Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu from the point of it's just a constant isometric contraction for, you're struggling against a dude. I mean, not to mention the, teaching people to what to do if they are ever in that, and finger crossed it never happens. But, if something does like that happen on the streets, you've got the skills you need to remain calm and take care of business.
That's exactly the hope. And so one of the things with it is, of course, you've got the person up in your personal space. Now, most of these people feel threatened by other people. So by having to actually confront and adapt to the fact that someone is physically touching them, physically on top of them, physically threatening them, even though it's within the rules and people are observing, etc., it teaches new motor patterns to go, I can cope. And what you have to keep always in mind, dear listeners, if anyone hears this, is that all thought is a motor output. Okay? So if you have a triggered loop, a fear pattern that's unconscious, that is a learned motor output. So you have to learn something more valuable for your survival to replace it, to give you more control over your system. Otherwise, your motor output that is learned, that's helped you survive for the last 27 years, is going to trigger as soon as that threat thing pops up. And
is there anything that because I know certainly with that mesencephalic wind-up and your adrenal fatigue style patients, the autonomic nervous system, so control over heart rate, it starts to become, and so just like energy availability is quite poor. So, I mean, I can think of a few patients who would seriously benefit from that style of approach, but just even the thought of them going for a walk around the block is just far too draining and fatiguing. So, I mean, there does need to be a sequence of events that, but Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu being one step along the road to healing.
Absolutely. This is where we were going to talk about a thing called a Dutch test, which is one of the tools I use to actually determine where people's hormones, their adrenal glands, sex hormones, etc., are on that continuum. Do they have too much cortisol, not enough cortisol? And we compare and contrast this to their blood tests and try and look at what a considered normal is. Because if you've got too low a level of cortisol, you're going to be chronically under-energized, especially if you wake up and your cortisol level is low. So this is also where what we've talked about in the previous podcast, where if we get low levels of iron and B12, you can't actually make energy. So again, remember, every mitochondria requires 4 molecules of iron to make energy come out the other end. So if we get low normal iron, we're in a lot of trouble. So remember, adrenaline is iron dependent and cortisol is iron dependent. And all your anabolic steroids are on an opposing iron dependent pathway to your cortisol. So if you're in chronic stress, your hormones to repair you are going to start to become suppressed over a period of time.
Yeah, that's interesting.
So
stress plus low iron means that's a bad mixture.
Absolutely, because something's going to get compromised. Your brain's still going to make the cortisol right up until it physically can't. So it's getting those things back up again.
Genetic expression point of view, I mean, what's happening there to help sort of, I suppose I'm looking at from a mechanistic point of view, how do we go about breaking that from a genetic expression point of view? So, I mean, we've got to get iron and B12 and folate all under control, and then whatever strategies that we can look at from a neurological point of view. But what sort of genetic expression effects is chronic stress going to have on someone?
So again, at that moment in time, this is where running the DNA profile that I tend to run can be really quite helpful, because we can look at things like what's called a CO-methyltransferase gene. So if your CO-methyltransferase gene is slow, we don't methylate to help turn on and off things like serotonin and dopamine. Now, dopamine is a precursor, goes down to form adrenaline and noradrenaline. So it all comes down that arm. So if you've got an MAO that's dysfunctional, or your MTHFR is dysfunctional, you can't make adrenaline properly or noradrenaline. So what we'll get is down-regulation of that system and an up-regulation of the sensitivity. So you produce more neurotransmitter receptors to try and make you more sensitive. Now, the flip side of that is you become more sensitive, therefore more anxious potentially, because you get a bigger jolt per dollar you put into the system.
Yeah. So it'd be an interesting one then for your thrill seekers and adrenaline junkies.
Yeah.
They've got that super sensitivity from that MTHFR gene not being up to scratch.
Absolutely. And it gets worse because, of course, you've got this gene code called a DR delta 2, which is a dopamine receptor delta 2 pathway. So you've got delta 1 and delta 2 and delta 3, etc. So delta 1 specifically affects an area in the brain called the basal ganglia, and more specifically, it is for your direct pathway. Okay, so that's your go, so to speak. Now, if you have a DR delta 2 polymorphism that it's not working at full tilt, your ability to inhibit yourself, because the DR delta 2 dopamine receptors affect your indirect pathway. So if your indirect pathway is not getting the right receptor activation, the dopamine that you're releasing is not going to inhibit your brain, and therefore your ability to do risky, stupid behavior is much, much, much more likely, and you're much more likely to develop an addictive personality disorder. Gambling, sex, porn, drugs, food, TV, computers, etc., etc. And so what this then does is, of course, if you don't have the receptors working properly and you've got a dysfunction, you can get your serotonin coming out of balance and you can't deactivate effectively, and then throw malnourishment in at the same time. So overall, we get situations where we're not fine-tuning. You know, you've got all the orchestra there, but the conductors are not making them sound very nice, and we get things firing, but the brain doesn't switch them on and off in a temporosummated fashion, whereby the timing sequence works or the volume of that signal works to actually make the behavior we want or don't want. Now, what makes this more interesting is that it's been shown that that children who've had a more stressful delivery, including cord wrapped around the neck, use of things like Syntocin or induction, as well as instrument deliveries, Von Tuss, forceps, and emergency cesareans, have some really interesting end results of their responses to stress. So we get one of two ways, and I think this is run somewhat by their polymorphisms as well, but they'll either become really, really insensitive to their cortisol and their stress hormones, or they'll become hypersensitive. So hypersensitive tends to become very stressed very easily and strongly lacking in resilience. They tend to have a very upregulated insula. Now, what's the end result of an upregulated insula?
Oh, insula doing your
suffering,
organ sensitivity.
Suffering.
You're talking about
suffering.
Okay.
These people suffer.
Is that singular?
So small amounts of insult give massive amounts of suffering, be it physical or emotional. And of course, cortisol is part and parcel of the cycle that allows the gating of pain in and out of the system. So if you've got heightened sensitivity to it, heightened stress response, and increased suffering, everything gets bad from there. And you end up chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, because everything hurts, and the flavor of pain goes up. So this is, of course, very, very stressful, and it forms a constant wind-up loop, because the more stressed you become, because again, remember, you've been stressed since before you were born. You're fighting for your life. So what will the body do? It's going to upregulate that mesencephalic activation. It can't tell where the problem is because it hasn't got a fully developed system to even deal with that. But there's a lack of oxygenation going in. I'm starving. What will happen to the mesenceph at that moment in time?
Oh, she's going to wind up.
So your entire system from that moment onwards, neurologically, is set to go. And then you get all the consequences.
Essentially, we've got either a genetic predisposition for stress or not based on those polymorphisms. And then you throw in stress, and then we start to hardwire either to become super sensitive to stress or super insensitive to stress.
Exactly.
And if you're super sensitized to stress, then your reaction to a stress is going to be much more hypervigilant, much more of a wound up point of view.
Yep.
Whereas if you become desensitized, your body then has to start to produce more adrenaline to fire up that system in a stressful environment. Because you've been desensitized to it and you still need to have that stress response.
Your receptors are turned down.
Yeah, in which case, if you're needing more fuel to burn, you're going to run out of fuel faster. Either way, you're screwed. So as far as sort of epigenetics and your ability to influence what genes are expressed and not, let's say we get someone neurologically rehabbed. We get that mesencephalon calm down inflammation. We get appropriate iron levels, B12, folate, biochemistry all under control. Is it then a case of knowing that, okay, these are your crappy genes and you've got a tendency towards this style of an issue, so you need to be aware of it. Here are some supplements that you may need to take for the rest of your life. Or if you stay away from that, so let's say we get someone essentially healthy from a stress point of view, keeping them in that sort of low stress state for long enough, will they then start to express different genotypes and different genes so that they're not getting that tendency? Like, how does that all fit in from an epigenetic point of view?
So that's a horrible question. And the answer to it is it depends on whose work you read and whose opinion you like to follow. So I've read a book recently entitled Dirty Genes, and he'd say, well, look, as long as you follow the diet and do what I suggest with this wash and detox of your body, it's all going to be great, and you're going to keep it all in balance, and you might not even really need to have supplements. Someone like Bruce Lipton will say that you can think your way clear of these things and you can alter your internal environment by just thinking. And I have some huge arguments with that, because what happened with my autistic daughter, in which case, she came out as all babies do without a brain, and she dysfunctioned immediately. So, it puts a hole straight through that particular theory that you can alter your internal genetic environment by thinking your way through it. But, so there are people and proponents saying that that's exactly what occurs. Now, I sit somewhere actually between the no, you can't change it, and yes, everything is absolutely changeable. I haven't seen anyone go long enough, and again, I point out that I've only been working in the functional neuro space kind of the last 10, 15 years. So I haven't had patients for 40 years to observe what actually occurs to them. Now, granted, epigenetics is a science that isn't even 40 years old particularly, so
it's about younger than MMA, isn't it?
Yeah, but what I believe to be true is that if you alter the environment, both the stimulus, because the environment that expresses genes it continues to evolve from what our receptors perceive to be true. So our eyes, our ears, our touch, our vestibular mechanism, our interosense, they form our reality, what our building blocks will give us, and how we focus our conscious resilience. So if we can retrain someone's mind state or their core self to actually focus their response to a stressor in a different way, if we can reframe it, the ability to alter the expression of certain chemicals, the amount of adrenaline and cortisol you need to deal with a particular problem will go down. So I don't think this actually alters the gene. You'll still be left with the gene, but how hard you push the button will go up or down based upon how your consciousness frames. Is this a good or a bad insult?
So not so much a change in genetic expression, but more a change in receptors and signaling pathways.
I think the signaling pathway and the how we drive it from because again, fundamentally, as I say, the environment is all that we perceive. So whether it's the food going into us, the chemicals going into us, our interior thought process, where, as I say, all thought process is a motor plan. So if our motor plans are executing in a resilient fashion versus a vigilant fashion, we're going to get a very different end outcome. So if we frame it in that was a good stress, not a terrible stress, we're going to probably waste less energy, waste less resources, have a better end outcome on the body. So
with I was just having a follow-on question. So with so you've either genetically predisposed and certain genes mean that you either become desensitized or supersensitized to stress. Would that not then be an argument either for SSRIs and so on in a desensitized person, but you could be careful if if you hit that button and they're getting super sensitized or an increased reaction, be careful with the medication in those individuals.
It is.
I mean, obviously, we're both chiropractors and we're not providing any advice on whether you should or should not be on medication. But from a neurological, physiological understanding of genetics, take it away.
Okay. So that question is a yes and a no, as all question to answers become. So
I'm not going to give you any easy ones, mate.
Because we're talking about a gene or a series of genes in 10,000 pairs, okay? And so because that one has upregulated receptor sensitivity or downregulated receptor sensitivity, we're talking about a part of a pathway in a whole system. And putting the SSRI or SNRI, etc., in there, which decreases the ability to get the chemical out of the synaptic cleft, might imbalance 12 other pathways. Okay? So the answer is always, in each individual case, yes, this person might really respond favorably to a pharmacological solution. But this person over here, because they've got all these other imbalances, if you do that, you're going to throw them into psychosis or some other problem, because we're only talking about one facet. And this is where we see patients who look like great candidates have terrible side effects.
Is the genetic testing, so Smart DNA is the company that you use?
That's the one I tend to use.
Yeah. Has what they're looking at gotten to the level where you can tell whether someone's going to respond favorably to those styles of medications yet, or is it still? Because I mean, ideally, you'd want to get to the stage where everyone's getting a DNA profile done up, and then based on that, saying, "Hey, is this a good idea or not?" Now, let me just take your genes. Yep, there we go. Or no, you've got this gene, let's not.
Okay, so again, as I seem to be very consistent, I'm going to say yes and no.
Beautiful.
So Smart DNA's core test that they use does not look at drug individual sensitivity. It's much more what we'd call nutrigenomics, looking at how your nutrient, food, lifestyle factors interact with your genome. So it doesn't really talk about drugs at all, but people who know a bit more about the epigenetics will be able to extrapolate a lot more about it and actually know what will and won't work. However, other companies, other labs run specific genome tests to determine, is this drug likely to have a positive or negative effect on you? So it's the science is there, but the lab I use for that test that I more commonly use doesn't do it. So yes, the science is there. We can do that. If we had a patient who is, intractable depression and failing everything, then running that particular genome sequencing to determine what drugs they would do well with and what they wouldn't would be an awesome idea, and we can definitely get it done.
Let's wade back into perhaps more easily answered questions. Can you comment on what affects chronic stress or that sort of hypervigilance / adrenal fatigue style patient, the effect that will have on the immune system?
So when we become very, very hyperactive in the right brain, what tends to occur is we drive a very strong inflammatory state. And so these people, you can get one of two different possibilities, but what we tend to see is people come in who have very, very strong responses to a situation. Like they'll come in and say, I never ever get sick. And you'll say, okay, that's great. So what's your sinus and hay fever like? Oh, yeah, I respond. I've got dust mite allergy and pollen, and I react to this thing and that thing. And so what we get is this nasty seesaw effect, that we're so vigilant because, again, remember, our immune systems were designed whereby the the body really only had certain types of things coming at it, dirt and bugs and infections. We didn't really have autoimmune stuff. So what the body does is it drives this defense system to say nothing's going to get in and kill me because we're under threat, but it becomes very vigilant to attack all sorts of little proteins, and it causes leaking of the digestive tract. The tight junctions start to stretch apart, and cortisol will actually do that. It causes damage to your tight junctions in the gut. So the more of that you excrete, the worse your gut function becomes, because again, when you're running from a monster, what use is having a really full belly? So it's down-regulating your gut. It's up-regulating your defensive system, but it's blunting your repair mechanism. So cortisol itself, your survival hormone, raises your blood sugar level, and this also tends to raise up your insulin level and tends to turn it into a spare tire around your midriff. So you get fat and tired at the same time as feeling stressed all the time, and you blunt the ability to heal. So it drives down your ability to repair, because cortisol is the guy that basically says it does not matter what's left as long as I survive. So it's going to burn anything in the house to keep you warm. So your $50,000 antique Georgian test, which you're never going to be able to get another one of, it went in the fire. Cortisol's the dude with the hatchet smashing the crap out of that thing, going, yeah, you're going down because I'm not going to. So you will break down all your muscle, all your ligaments, all your sinews before you start burning fat in that situation, because cortisol will keep your blood going to make you survive. So being long-term chronic stress isn't very good for healing.
No, very much not.
No,
very much not.
So if you think about it, what we get as an obvious example, which you'll know a little bit about, is the more stressed our body becomes, the more we start damaging our barrier membranes, our epithelium, our skin layers. So we get poor healing of it. High inflammatory level, because anything that comes near it, we want to react to. So we become heightened inflammatory, heightened sensitivity, high histamine responses, reacting to all foods, all chemicals, all everything, sore, dry, irritable.
So, speaking, I had a, it's been interesting with, obviously you're aware of my history with eczema and that sort of thing, but the last, it was probably about 2 weeks ago, just went through a shocking amount of stress all at once. It was just a bad week, several things going on. Mm-hmm. And food sensitivity went way up. Skin inflammation about 3 days after that started to go up. And then, it's just... It's interesting that the difference stress can have on your ability to tolerate those things from an immune perspective.
Absolutely. It doesn't do us an absolute power of good whatsoever. So don't get stressed, anyone. Take it from me. just stop that.
Just be happy. Just stop stressing.
Yeah.
Well, I think it then comes down to just make sure you've got the tools in your armament to control your stress as much as possible, whether that's psychological or pharmacological or biochemistry and supplemental. But whatever works for you, make sure you're doing it.
Well, that makes absolute sense. So again, most simplistic idea, we've got to keep cortisol down. So one of our simple ideas is we've got to do stuff that's going to calm your adrenal drive. So we have to calm the drivers of that, which is, in my opinion, largely the mesencephalon. We have to keep blood sugar regulated, because if your blood sugar goes up too high, you're going to get an insulin response, which will drop your blood sugar, which will cause your blood sugar to have to spike up again, because you've got to hunt for food that pushes your blood sugar because you're running from a monster. From there, of course, your respiratory cycle tends to go up and you get tightening in your neck and anterior shoulder muscles. So, of course, you need to be doing something to actually relax your breathing, because the faster you're breathing, the more stressed your brain thinks you are. And, of course...
How much stock do you hold?
Sorry?
How much stock do you hold with the respiratory acidosis and alkalosis? Because we've got so many systems devoted to alkalinity or acid, like controlling pH balance. I'd imagine like just that steady, constant stress wind up and hyperventilation would affect your acidity to a point.
Oh, it's a really interesting one because, of course, you get to see all the different concepts that are out there on Facebook and internet land, and there's either a pro camp of you got to get alkaline, you drink your alkaline water and eat your alkaline vegetables and take your cider vinegar and it's magic, magic, magic. And then there's the hardline science dudes who are like, well, your kidneys aren't ever going to let that occur. So somewhere in between is actually the truth, as always, because
I've given you another yes/no answer. That's a nice one.
You got to get me consistent here. So the situation basically is that if you eat and consume highly acidic creating foods, okay, now you got to think about what that actually means. Something that's highly acid creating in the system is probably something that's like a soft drink, high amounts of sugar, foods that require a lot of detoxification. And so ultimately, acid-base balance in the body is all about redox potential and free radicals. So
just to jump in there, so anything that requires a fair bit of detoxification, would that also, if you've got a food sensitivity, be an acidity driving food group?
Yeah, absolutely. So foods that... Just 1 second, Eric.
No worries.
No.
I'm going to go.
Otherwise, good. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll leave a note.
Cool. No trouble.
All right, cool.
So foods that drive or have a food sensitivity will, of course, spike a adrenaline response, and they will drive a little bit of cortisol in the system, and that will, of course, every time you release a molecule of adrenaline, you release 2 free radicals. See the catch? So you got to soak up those free radicals because otherwise they're going to tear into your membranes and create inflammatory cascades. Because again, what we talk about with this acid alkaline, we imagine the great big green juice or a bottle of cider vinegar or we're thinking objects, but acidification is all about redox potential. Something like bicarb soda, which is technically kind of a weak alkaline, works really, really effectively to soak up free radical damage in the system and neutralizes acid. Because, of course, your body will not let you become highly acidic. It's going to keep you within a pH range, right? So, it's going to keep you somewhere like 7.1 to 7.4, and you're never going to get above 7.4, otherwise you're dead. Simple. You're dead. Doesn't matter. So you can't get more alkaline. So when people are talking about massively alkaline everything, they're talking piffle because they don't really understand science. However, to maintain that pH in your body costs you bucket loads of resources. So where did you get the buffer, the alkaline, to soak up the free radicals, the pH going wonky? You use... calcium carbonate. Where do you get that from?
Oh, this is going to be sucking it away from your bones, isn't it?
Bones. That's exactly where you get it from. So consuming stuff that makes you generate free radicals that need buffering in the bloodstream will potentiate things like bone diseases.
Interesting. So that's another one for your osteoporotic people out there. If you're... Now, you may be driving you too alkaline or too acidic and you run out of resources.
Absolutely. So if you think about a soft drink, your average soft drink, and you could think about a cola product for one, they've got a pH of somewhere around 3.3. So they have a very strong acid in it called phosphoric acid. And you can break down a bunch of stuff with that one. It'll pull calcium out of chicken bones. It's a cool experiment. If anyone wants to see it to prove it, get yourself a jar, roast your chicken on the weekend, take the chicken leg out of that, get rid of the flesh. You've got the bone sitting there. Put the thigh bone in the glass, pour a can of cola, not blaming any names here. It's hard. Any of them will do it. It doesn't matter, but cola's quite obvious for this. And you leave it in that jar, lid on, for about 2 weeks. Then take it out and see what happens.
I did a similar thing as a kid. One of my teeth fell out, and then Mum said, let's put it in a glass of Coke. I heard that's a thing. Did that for a couple of days and then pulled it out, and that thing fell apart with a tap of a spoon.
Yeah, it's not good stuff. And the point is that your stomach acid is about 2 to 3. It should be, if your stomach acid is working properly, it's about 2 to 3 on the pH scale. So every time you pour in a highly phosphorylated or high phosphoric acid soda, you have to, if it's outside of your normal feeding times, you have to neutralize that extra acid. See the problem? But it's also one of the reasons why the food companies, the fast food ones, they give you your burger or your chicken, and they give you a Coke or a Pepsi with it, don't they?
Oh, you got to they don't digestive enzymes are shot to shit. You got to digest it somehow.
Correct, absolutely. It cuts through all the fat and makes your mouth feel less gummy. It also gives you a decent shot of sugar, which helps you release serotonin, which makes you feel temporarily better. And you think, I'm satiated, I feel good. No, you've just spiked all your blood sugar and messed yourself up for ages. But at the same time, your body has to neutralize all that acid. Because again, it's going to keep you in a very specific pH scale. So you then will have to pull pancreatic bicarbonate or, calcium carbonate from somewhere to keep your pH right. Otherwise, trouble will ensue. You damage yourself. Yeah, that'd get a bit stressful for your system, wouldn't it? And then, of course, within 20 minutes, all of that sugar's gone into your bloodstream because it'll absorb really, really, really easily. Because, we do.
Liquid sugar.
Yeah. And where's it going to go? It's going to go straight to your liver. And if you're under stress, your body will probably try and store it as future glycogen stores and turn it into kind of liver stored fat. And then kind of as your blood sugar crashes, your brain is hopefully going to turn it back into glucose again to keep running it. But the likelihood is that it won't, because your brain is so stressed, it now believes you're in a famine, and it's going to hold on to that glycogen in your liver or your liver fat, and it will turn into what's called non-alcoholic steatosis or fatty liver disease. And from there, guess which your next disease stop is?
From liver, it's got to be kidneys.
Diabetes is the first one.
Oh, yeah, okay.
And metabolic syndrome. And then with the metabolic syndrome, you then go on to develop diabetes.
And the cycle continues. It's neat how everything starts to cycle back to the same couple of problems. No matter which bloody area of your biochemistry we're talking about, it does seem to come back to either obesity or diabetes as your first stepping stone along the line to dementia and Alzheimer's and Parkinson's.
So it's good fun.
If you make it that far. Mate, we're coming up to, I've got to pick up the kids o'clock. Beautiful talk. Is there any closing remarks that we want to talk about other than, hey guys, if you're stressed, do something about it. Don't stay stressed. Stop eating and drinking shit and Coca-Cola.
Don't eat junk food. Get your epigenetics looked at so that you can tell what your body does when it's pushed into a corner.
Certainly made a huge difference when I started with you and getting my health under control.
It's a really clever thing. Maintain your B vitamin levels. I haven't ever met anyone who didn't benefit from activated B vitamins. As I say, the Celts, which is a really large population of the Australian landscape, really benefit from these activated B12s and folate. I don't know why the medics really don't see that the level of B vitamins, folate, B6, B12 in the bloodstream, it needs to be higher. Like that, they've got these really wonderfully low levels. Like 162 is the minimum level that B12 is allowed to be on the test I saw today. Whereas people do better when it's up at around 800 or 1,000, which is supposedly the top end of the range. And no one does well down at the bottom. They get tiredness, fatigue, anxiety patterns, kind of numbness and tingling. It leads to peripheral neuropathies. It's just bad news. And we keep telling people, oh, you're fine. Just don't. People need more nourishment than we're getting. That's just the long and short of it. Practice
when in doubt,
mindfulness, breathe more effectively, do exercise, and do things that cause you to turn and face your fears. Get that stuff out of your unconscious mind, get it into your conscious mind to get the power of fear out of your unconscious and into your own personal control. It's the best advice I can give to anyone. I can guarantee you from my perspective, when I started doing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, which gave me physical skills, my anxiety and fear patterns went down.
Yeah, well, again, huge for breaking those long-term mesencephalic fear-based loops. Mate, let's wrap up. So if anyone wants to get in contact with Dr. Scott Wustenberg, he can be reached on 0733 710 222. Otherwise, you can grab him on an email. What's your email address, mate?
It's Toowong, TOOWONG @optimallife.com.au.
Yeah, beautiful. And guys, if you want to get in touch with me, it's eric@brainandbodyhealth.com.au. As always, mate, it's been an absolute pleasure. If any of our listeners have got questions that you want answered, feel free to email either myself or Scott and say, hey, please don't swear at me, but say, hey, what would you like us to talk about? And we'll talk about it. But otherwise, guys, stay tuned to next time for podcast number... I think that's number lucky 13. We'll have to talk about something something sinister and record it on a Friday. Anyway,
cool.
Next time. All right, mate.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching. To learn more from Dr. Scott, visit our site at optihuman.com.au.